neighbors terrorized an elderly widow until 30 bikers parked outside her house. In episode 1, Margaret Collins had lived in her small Maple Street home for nearly 5 decades. It was the house where she raised her children, built a life with her late husband Daniel, and held on to every memory that made the place feel like home. For most of those years, the neighborhood had been peaceful, but everything changed when new neighbors moved in next door. Within weeks, the harassment began. Loud music blasted late into the night. Trash was thrown into Margaret's yard. Beer bottles landed in her garden. Sometimes someone even pounded on her front door after midnight and ran away laughing. Margaret slowly realized something disturbing. The neighbors weren't just being rude. They were trying to force her to sell her home. But Margaret refused to leave the house she had lived in for 47 years. One afternoon, while struggling with groceries, she met a biker named Jack who stopped to help. When he asked about the chaos next door, Margaret quietly told him everything. Jack listened carefully. Then he made a simple promise. He would stop by again. 3 nights later, the quiet street suddenly filled with the rumble of motorcycles. And when Margaret looked outside, she saw something that made the neighbors fall silent for the first time in months. Jack had returned, with an entire biker club. And that's where our story continues. The first motorcycle engine shut off. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the quiet street that had been tormented by noise every night suddenly fell into a silence so deep it almost felt unnatural. More than 20 motorcycles now lined the curb in front of Margaret Collins' small white house. Heavy chrome glinted under the streetlights. Leather vests covered with patches moved slowly as the riders dismounted. And across the yard, the neighbors who had spent months terrorizing an 81-year-old widow stood frozen on their porch. The music from their speakers had stopped instantly. For the first time in a very long time, the bullies had no idea what to do next. Because the man who stepped toward Margaret's front gate was the same biker who had helped her pick up groceries a few days earlier. Jack. And tonight, he hadn't come alone. But before we continue, let's quickly remember how everything started. If you believe kindness can come from the most unexpected places, make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Heroes. Because stories like this prove that sometimes the people who look the toughest on the outside are the ones with the biggest hearts. Before we jump back into the story, tell us in the comments. What city or country are you watching from today? It's always incredible seeing people from around the world joining these stories. Now let's go back to Maple Street. Because the moment those motorcycles arrived, everything began to change. Margaret stood in the living room, her hands lightly gripping the curtain as she peeked through the window. Her heart was racing. She had never seen so many motorcycles gathered in one place before. The deep rumble of engines had shaken the quiet street only moments earlier. Now the machines sat in a long line along the curb. Chrome headlights reflected the yellow glow of the street lamps. Leather vests moved slowly as the riders stepped off their bikes. Margaret recognized one face immediately. Jack. He walked up the path toward her house with calm, steady steps. When he reached the porch, he knocked gently. Not the aggressive pounding she had grown used to hearing late at night. Just a respectful knock. Margaret opened the door cautiously. Jack smiled. Evening, Margaret. She looked past him at the line of bikers standing near the curb. Her voice trembled slightly. Jack, what is all this? He glanced back over his shoulder. Oh, he said casually. Just some friends stopping by. Behind him, one of the bikers chuckled softly. Margaret stepped onto the porch. She could see nearly 24 riders now. Men and women. Different ages. But they all wore the same kind of leather vest covered in patches. And they were all standing quietly, watching the house next door. The neighbors were still on their porch. The loud music that had dominated the street every night had been turned off. Now they whispered nervously among themselves. One of them finally shouted across the yard. Hey, what's going on here? Jack didn't raise his voice. He simply looked in their direction. We're visiting our friend, he said calmly. The neighbor scoffed. You can't just bring a gang into the neighborhood. Jack tilted his head slightly. Pretty sure we can park on a public street. The man didn't respond. Instead, he disappeared inside the house. Margaret looked up at Jack. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. Jack shrugged. Maybe not. Then he added something that made her chest tighten. But nobody should have to live scared in their own home. The other bikers slowly spread out along the sidewalk. Some leaned casually against their motorcycles. Others stood with their arms folded. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten anyone. They simply stayed, watching, present. And for the first time in months, Maple Street was peaceful. No music, no shouting, no bottles thrown across the fence. Margaret sat on her porch with Jack for nearly an hour. They talked about small things. Her late husband, his years riding across the country, the neighborhood. Occasionally, one of the bikers would walk over and introduce themselves politely. "Evening, ma'am. Nice to meet you." Margaret couldn't believe it. These people who looked intimidating to outsiders were treating her with more kindness than the neighbors next door ever had. Around 9 o'clock, Jack finally stood up. "Well, Margaret," he said, "we should probably get going." She looked down the street at the motorcycles. "They came all this way just for tonight." Jack smiled. "Not exactly." Margaret frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He placed his helmet under his arm. "We'll be back tomorrow." Then he winked. And the night after that, Margaret felt something warm spread through her chest. Hope. The bikers started their engines. One by one, the motorcycles roared back to life. The deep rumble echoed through the street. But this time, it wasn't a sound of intimidation. It was a sound of protection. The next evening, at exactly the same time, the motorcycles returned. So did the night after that. And the night after that. Within a week, something remarkable happened. The harassment completely stopped. No more trash. No more music shaking the walls. No more knocking at midnight. The neighbors barely even stepped outside when the bikers were present. But that wasn't the end of the story. Because Jack had noticed something that didn't sit right with him. One afternoon, while Margaret was watering the few surviving flowers in her garden, Jack crouched near the fence line. "What are you looking at?" she asked. He pointed toward the neighbor's yard. "You ever notice all those trucks?" Margaret had. Different trucks arrived almost every afternoon. They stayed for an hour or two, then left. Jack stood slowly. "Mind if I ask you something?" "Of course." "Has anyone ever offered to buy your house?" Margaret blinked. "Yes, actually. A man came by a few months ago." "What did he say?" "He offered cash." Jack frowned. "How much?" Margaret told him the number. Jack let out a low whistle. "That's way above market value." Margaret nodded slowly. "I thought it was strange too." Then Jack looked back at the neighbor's house again. Something in his expression changed. The next evening, 2 police cars quietly rolled down Maple Street. Margaret watched from her porch in confusion. Officers walked directly to the neighbor's house. Jack stood nearby with his arms folded. Within minutes, loud shouting erupted inside. Then the front door burst open. 3 men were led outside in handcuffs. Margaret gasped. "What happened?" Jack sat beside her again. "Turns out," he said calmly, "they weren't just throwing parties." Margaret stared as officers searched the house. Boxes were carried out. Equipment. Cash. One officer spoke quietly to Jack before leaving. Margaret looked at him again. "Jack, what was going on?" He sighed. "Looks like they were running an illegal operation." "What kind?" "Stolen electronics." The trucks that had been arriving every afternoon suddenly made sense. Jack continued. "And they wanted your house because it connects to the alley behind both properties." Margaret frowned. "Why does that matter?" "Easy access." The neighbors hadn't just been trying to drive her away for fun. They wanted her property to expand their operation. But Margaret had unknowingly ruined their plan by refusing to leave. The harassment had been their last attempt to force her out. Within days, the house next door was empty. The police investigation shut down the entire operation. For the first time in months, Maple Street was quiet again. Truly quiet. A week later, Margaret sat on her porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange behind the trees. A familiar rumble approached down the street. Jack pulled up alone this time. He parked beside the curb and removed his helmet. Margaret smiled. "You're early today." He laughed. "No trouble anymore. Just visiting." He handed her a small box. "What's this?" "From the club." Margaret opened it carefully. Inside was a small wooden plaque. Carved into the surface were the words, "Margaret's house. Protected by friends." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." Jack sat beside her quietly. "You already did." "How?" He gestured toward the house. "You stayed." Margaret looked at the place she had called home for nearly half a century. The porch, the garden, the memories, and now, the peace. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they arrive on motorcycles. And sometimes the toughest-looking people are the ones who simply refuse to let someone be bullied. Maple Street never forgot the night the bikers arrived. But Margaret never forgot something even more important. Kindness can appear in the most unexpected forms. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, Not on my watch. And from that day forward, Margaret Collins never had to face another night of fear again.